China told Iran to fight. China told Iran to negotiate. China told Trump it wants a deal. 3 messages, 3 contradictions. One country playing everyone at once, and here is the part that should terrify you. It might actually be working. In the last 24 hours, the full architecture of what Beijing has been quietly constructing for the past several months has begun to come into focus. And once you see the shape of it, you cannot unsee it. This is not a story about diplomacy. This is not a story about trade. This is a story about the most sophisticated geopolitical double cross in modern history, executed in plain sight, misread by almost everyone, and now approaching a moment where one wrong move collapses the entire structure. This is Geo Insight Command, where power shifts are decoded before the headlines catch up. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this, because what you are about to understand, most people will not figure out for weeks. Let us start with the surface layer, because the surface layer is already shocking enough on its own. In May 2026, President Xi Jinping and President Donald Trump are scheduled to meet. That meeting is not accidental. It is not casual. It is the culmination of months of carefully managed signaling, back-channel coordination, and strategic positioning by Beijing. China wants back into the American market. The tariff war has left wounds. Chinese exports have taken a serious hit. The pressure on the Chinese economy from sustained trade restrictions is real, measurable, and deeply felt inside the leadership circle around Xi. So the posture Xi brings to that May meeting is not entirely antagonistic. He is not walking in as an enemy. He is walking in as a deal maker. And that matters enormously because it means Xi has a reason, a very powerful, very expensive reason to appear cooperative with Washington right now. But here is where things get complicated. Because at the exact same moment, Xi is softening his posture toward Trump. Something else is happening on the other side of the world. In April 2026, negotiations between Iran and the United States took place in Pakistan. Secret talks, structured talks, talks that on the surface looked like Iran choosing to engage diplomatically. But intelligence analysts who follow Beijing's pressure channels tell a very different story. China exerted pressure on Iran to participate in those negotiations. Tehran did not want to be there. Iran's initial position was refusal, and yet Iran showed up. The question is why? The answer, when you trace it back, leads directly to Beijing. And this is where things get worse. Because China is not just pressuring Iran to negotiate. China is simultaneously providing Iran with the tools to keep fighting. Not through open military contracts, not through declared weapons shipments. Beijing has always understood that visibility is vulnerability. So it operates differently. It exports civilian goods that have dual-use military applications. It conducts covert logistics through intermediary networks. It ensures that Iranian industrial capacity does not collapse under the weight of sanctions and battlefield attrition. President Xi does not want Iran to lose this war. That is the core of it. Say that again and let it land. China does not want Iran to lose. And the reason is not ideological. It is not about solidarity or shared values or any of the rhetoric that gets deployed in public statements. The reason is oil, cheap oil. Reliable oil, the kind of oil that only a sanctions-isolated, economically desperate Iran is willing to sell at the prices Beijing needs. Military analysts are already warning that China's covert support network for Iran represents one of the most complex dual-use supply chain operations ever assembled. The structure is designed to be deniable, designed to be invisible to satellite imagery and port manifest reviews, designed to survive scrutiny. And it has. Because even now, as this conversation is happening, the full scope of what is flowing from Chinese industrial networks into Iranian military supply chains remains partially classified, partially disputed, and largely absent from mainstream coverage. But that is not the real problem. The real problem is what a U.S. victory over Iran would actually mean for China. Not just economically, strategically, architecturally, because in 2023, something happened that permanently elevated China's stake in the Middle East. The Saudi-Iran rapprochement. That agreement, brokered by Beijing under what China calls its Global Security Initiative, was not just a diplomatic achievement. It was a signal to the Gulf, to the global South, to every non-Western nation watching that China was now a credible security guarantor, that the United States was no longer the only power capable of reshaping regional dynamics, that Beijing could broker peace where Washington had brokered only pressure. That was a landmark moment, and Xi knows it. Every senior strategist inside Zhongnanhai knows it. Because what they built in 2023 was not just a peace agreement. It was credibility. It was proof of concept for an entirely new architecture of global influence. One where China sits at the center of a web of security relationships, economic dependencies, and political alignments that slowly, deliberately pulls the world away from American-led institutions. A U.S. victory in Iran unravels all of that. Think about what it looks like from the perspective of every country that signed onto China's Global Security Initiative. Think about every nation in the global South that looked at the Saudi-Iran deal and thought, maybe Beijing can protect us too. Maybe we do not need Washington anymore. Maybe there is another path. Now imagine the United States militarily defeats Iran. Imagine the government in Tehran collapses or is dramatically weakened. Imagine the country that China guaranteed, the country whose regional legitimacy China helped restore, is dismantled by American power. What message does that send? It sends the message that China's security guarantees are hollow, that Beijing talks but cannot deliver. That when it matters, when the pressure is real and the stakes are existential, China steps back and lets its partners fall. That is not a message Xi can afford to send. Not now. Not when he is still building the architecture. Not when the global South is still deciding whether to fully commit to a China-centered alternative order. The credibility of everything Xi has constructed since 2017 depends in part on Iran not being visibly destroyed by American power. And this is where everything gets layered and dangerous at the same time. Because China cannot openly defend Iran. If Beijing deploys military assets to protect Tehran, the May meeting with Trump collapses. The trade deal disappears. The economic pressure on China intensifies to a level that Beijing's domestic situation cannot absorb. Xi cannot afford that either. So he is doing something far more sophisticated. He is holding Iran up with one hand, covertly, deniably, through supply chains and dual-use technology and quiet diplomatic backstopping, while simultaneously pushing Iran toward the negotiating table with the other. And with the third hand, yes, we need a third hand to describe this, he is presenting himself to Trump as a constructive partner interested in stability and deal-making. 3 simultaneous operations. 3 contradictory messages, 1 unified strategic objective. Intelligence reports suggest that the pressure Beijing applied to get Iran into the Pakistan negotiations was not subtle inside the channels where it occurred. China made clear to Tehran that continued total resistance to any diplomatic engagement was not aligned with Beijing's interests. And when China tells Iran that something is not aligned with Beijing's interests, Iran understands what that means. Because the relationship between China and Iran is not a partnership of equals. It is a dependency, Iran needs Chinese buyers for its oil. Iran needs Chinese technology to keep its industrial base functioning under sanctions. Iran needs Chinese diplomatic cover in the United Nations to prevent the passage of resolutions that would further strangle it. Tehran is not in a position to simply dismiss Beijing's preferences. So Iran showed up to Pakistan, not because it wanted to, because it could not afford not to. But here is the other edge of the same blade. China also cannot let Iran negotiate itself into a position of genuine weakness. Because a weakened Iran that has made concessions to Washington under pressure is an Iran that might drift towards some form of accommodation with the American-led order. And that Iran is worth much less to Beijing than the current Iran, isolated, desperate, and entirely dependent on Chinese economic lifelines. The ideal outcome for China is a negotiation that goes nowhere fast. That looks like progress without producing it. That buys time without resolving anything. That keeps Iran in the conflict long enough to exhaust American political will, drain Washington's resources, and eventually produce a stalemate that allows Beijing to position itself as the indispensable mediator. The reality is, China is not trying to end this war. China is trying to manage this war. There is a profound difference between those two things, and the entire international community has consistently confused one for the other. Defense experts understand that what Beijing is executing right now is a strategy with deep historical roots in Chinese strategic tradition. The concept is sometimes translated as fighting while negotiating, a dual-track approach that uses military pressure and diplomatic engagement not as alternatives, but as simultaneous instruments of a single coherent strategy. Keep your adversary uncertain. Keep your ally dependent. Keep your own options open. Never fully commit to any single path in a way that forecloses others. This is not improvisation. This is doctrine applied at scale. And now look at the numbers, because the numbers make the stakes visceral. China's investments and economic exposure inside Iran are estimated at or approaching $100 billion. The 2020's Naksha Abond and Chatsker and Cher and Chakshech 25-year cooperation agreement between Beijing and Tehran was worth on paper $400 billion over its lifetime. Chinese firms are embedded in Iranian infrastructure, in ports, in railways, in energy extraction, in telecommunications. The Chinese economic presence in Iran is not a marginal trade relationship. It is structural. It is woven into the fabric of how Iran functions as an economy. If Iran collapses, if the political structure fractures under military pressure, if the government falls or dramatically transforms, all of that exposure becomes uncertain overnight. Contracts become unenforceable. Partnerships become liabilities. The oil supply becomes unreliable. And Beijing is left holding the wreckage of a $100 billion bet on a government that no longer exists. She cannot let that happen. But he also cannot be seen fighting to prevent it. And this is where things get worse, not just for China, but for everyone trying to calculate what comes next. Because the scenario where this double game works perfectly, where China successfully keeps Iran functional, steers it toward a cosmetic negotiation, satisfies Trump enough to secure a trade deal in May, and preserves its Gulf architecture, that scenario requires everything to go exactly right simultaneously. It requires Iran to accept Chinese pressure without resenting it to the point of rupture. It requires Trump to interpret Chinese diplomatic overtures as genuine without probing too deeply into what Beijing is doing on the other side. It requires the covert support channels into Iran to remain invisible to American intelligence. It requires the global South to remain passive and not force Beijing to publicly choose sides. That is an enormous number of things that all need to go right at the same time, and none of them are guaranteed. Let us think through the options, because when a strategy this complex begins to crack, the available responses tend to be bad, worse, or catastrophic. If American intelligence fully documents China's covert support for Iran and makes it public before the May meeting, Trump faces an immediate political choice. He can proceed with the meeting anyway, which looks like weakness and invites domestic political devastation. He can cancel the meeting, which ratchets up the economic confrontation between the two largest economies on Earth. Or he can confront Xi directly inside the meeting, which turns a potential trade negotiation into an accusatory summit with unpredictable outcomes. None of those options produce the stable result either side claims to want. None of them are clean. All of them carry serious secondary consequences that ripple outward in ways that are difficult to control. If Iran decides that Chinese pressure to negotiate is itself a betrayal, if Tehran's hardliners conclude that Beijing is selling them out in exchange for a trade deal with Washington, the relationship fractures. Not completely. Iran cannot afford to walk away from China entirely, but it becomes complicated, unpredictable. And an unpredictable Iran that feels abandoned by its primary external patron is a destabilizing force of a very particular and dangerous kind. That Iran might accelerate its most extreme military options, might close off negotiating paths entirely, might make moves in the Strait of Hormuz or across the wider Gulf that force reactions from multiple parties simultaneously. If China's covert logistics network into Iran is disrupted, if the United States or one of its partners intercepts a key supply chain, exposes a front company, or sanctions a critical intermediary, Beijing faces a choice between escalating its covert operation to compensate or accepting that its support capability has been degraded. Either response is costly. Escalating means greater exposure and greater risk of the entire operation becoming undeniable. Accepting the degradation means Iran becomes weaker faster, which accelerates the timeline toward outcomes China cannot afford. The truth is, there is no clean option available to any of the players in this structure right now. Every path forward carries serious costs and serious risks. And the only reason this architecture has held together this long is that everyone involved has had strong incentives to pretend that the contradictions are manageable, to pretend that China can credibly play all sides, to pretend that Iran does not know it is being managed, to pretend that Washington does not see what Beijing is doing. But pretending has limits. Pretending cannot hold forever. And the moment one of these players stops pretending, the moment one of them forces the contradiction into the open, the entire structure fails very fast. Military analysts are already warning that the window for controlled resolution is narrowing. Every week that passes without a genuine diplomatic breakthrough inside the Iran negotiations is a week that makes the covert support architecture more necessary for Iran's survival, which makes it more extensive, which makes it harder to deny, which makes the May meeting more loaded with hidden tensions that neither side has agreed to surface. The longer this goes on, the more dangerous the eventual moment of clarity becomes. What this means is that the May 2026 Trump-Xi meeting is not a trade summit with a geopolitical backdrop. It is the surface layer of an extraordinarily compressed confrontation between two fundamentally incompatible strategic objectives. Trump wants China to stop supporting Iran, or at minimum to stop supporting Iran in ways that prolong American exposure in the region. Xi wants American market access and tariff relief without having to abandon the Iranian asset that protects his Gulf architecture. Those two things cannot both be true at the same time. One of them has to yield. And whichever side yields first loses something profound, not just in this negotiation, but in the longer contest over what the international order actually looks like for the next 20 years. This changes everything, not in the way that phrase is usually deployed as a rhetorical device. This actually structurally changes the calculus of every relationship in the Middle East and beyond. Because if China successfully pulls this off, if it manages to keep Iran functional, deliver a cosmetic negotiation, satisfy Trump enough for a trade deal, and preserve its Gulf credibility all at the same time, it will have demonstrated a capacity for strategic complexity that no other power in the world can match. It will have shown that it can simultaneously manage adversarial relationships, dependency relationships, and partnership relationships without any of the parties involved fully understanding what is happening until it is already done. That is not just an intelligence achievement. That is a civilization-level strategic accomplishment. And if it fails, if the contradictions collapse inward and the double cross becomes visible to everyone simultaneously, then the damage is not just to China's position in the Gulf. It is to the entire concept of the China-centered alternative order. It is to the global security initiative. It is to every country that looked at the 2023 Saudi-Iran rapprochement and decided that maybe Beijing was a credible partner. All of that credibility becomes fragile in a single news cycle. The architecture Xi has spent years and enormous political capital constructing starts to look like an overextended bluff. And the United States, battered, expensive, politically exhausted from its own engagements, suddenly looks like the only power that actually delivers when it commits. The stakes, in other words, are not just about Iran and China and a trade meeting in May. The stakes are about which version of the international order survives the next 18 months. Whether the world continues to drift toward multipolarity, toward a system where China provides an alternative center of gravity that constrains American unilateralism, or whether American power reasserts itself in a way that collapses that drift and pulls the global South back toward a Washington-centered architecture. This single double cross, this simultaneous pressure on Iran, covert support for Iran, and diplomatic performance for Trump is a microcosm of that entire contest. Every decision made in the next several weeks reverberates across that larger question. Defense experts understand that we are watching something rare, a moment where the hidden architecture of power becomes briefly, partially visible, where the moves that are usually made in the dark, in private meeting rooms and encrypted channels and carefully deniable logistics networks cast shadows large enough to see from the outside. These moments do not last. The curtain drops again. The visibility closes. The deniability reasserts itself. But for right now, in this window, the shape of what is happening is visible enough to understand. And what it shows is a level of strategic ambition and operational complexity that should fundamentally reframe how any serious analyst thinks about China's role in the world. This changes everything. Again, because every time you think you understand what China is doing, there is another layer underneath. Another objective being pursued simultaneously. Another relationship being managed in a way that seems contradictory until you understand the unified goal underneath all of it. The goal is simple, even if the execution is extraordinarily complex. China wants a world where no single power, including itself, has unchallenged dominance. Because in a multipolar world, China, with its economic scale and its geographic position and its patient strategic culture, has structural advantages. In a unipolar world dominated by American power, China is always on the outside of the architecture looking in. So everything, the Iran support, the Gulf diplomacy, the trade negotiations with Trump, the global security initiative, the covert logistics networks, everything serves that single strategic objective. A world where the rules are contested, where American power cannot act unilaterally without cost, where China has enough leverage in enough places to shape outcomes without having to fight for them directly. The question, and this is the question that no one inside any of the relevant governments has cleanly answered, is whether that strategy is sustainable, whether the contradictions it generates can be managed indefinitely, or whether they accumulate to a point of structural collapse. Whether the double cross remains deniable long enough to deliver its intended outcomes, or whether it becomes visible too soon at the worst possible moment in a way that forces a crisis none of the players can contain. And here is where the pacing slows down, where the weight of what we have just walked through settles. 3 messages, 3 contradictions, 1 country. The greatest geopolitical double cross in modern history is unfolding right now, not in some distant future strategic scenario, but in real time, in the weeks before a May meeting that is being described publicly as a trade summit and privately represents something far more consequential. The decisions made in those rooms against this backdrop will shape which version of the world we are living in by the end of this decade. So ask yourself this: if China succeeds, if the double cross works, and Beijing comes out of 2026 with its trade relationship with Washington partially restored, Iran still functional, its Gulf architecture intact, and its credibility with the global South unbroken, what does that tell us about the limits of American power? And if it fails, if the contradictions collapse and Xi is forced to choose publicly and irrevocably between Washington and Tehran, which way does he choose? And what does that choice trigger in every capital that has been watching and waiting to decide whose side they are finally on? Those questions do not have easy answers. They may not have any answers yet, but they are the questions that define the moment we are in. And paying attention to them, really paying attention, not just to the surface events, but to the hidden architecture underneath, is the difference between understanding what is actually happening in the world and being surprised by it. Stay close, because this story is not finished. Not even close.